Well, hopefully this isn't too risque for your podcast, but I'll give you a funny story. So I was filling in. We had multiple trainers who would work in the studio, and sometimes we'd trade clients. We went out on vacation or something like that, and I was training another gentleman's client, and she came in. She got up on the treadmill, and we were just chatting. She was warming up. I was trying to get to know her a little bit, and I said, "Well, what do you do?" And she said, "Well, I'm a dancer." And I said, "Well, that's kind of fascinating. What sort of dancer?" And she comes back with, "I work at the gentleman's club over at, wherever." And so I'm like, all I'm thinking in my head is, I'm like, please don't ask me what I do. And so she does, of course. And I'm like, well, I'm a Master of Divinity student at Moody Bible Institute. And she's like, oh. And I mean, it was really quiet the rest of the session. So yes, you met all sorts. And it really was a lot of fun conversations. And even had a few clients go to church with me.
Everybody, you are listening to the FaithWorks Lancaster Conversations on Calling podcast. I am getting better at pronouncing the full name that Eric and I have decided to call this thing. So we're doing great. Welcome, everybody. As a reminder, this podcast is Eric and I's listening tour on conversations with guests who are going to help us think well about how we bridge that Sunday to Monday gap. And hopefully we're bridging it a little bit now by this episode, but I'm super excited for this guest. But before I get to that, I'm just gonna hand it over to Eric, because Eric is much better qualified to introduce this guest than I am. So take it away, buddy.
There we go. Whoever slightly knows the guest better is the one who introduces them.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm very excited to welcome to our podcast Dr. James Spencer today. James is a theologian, author, and host of the Thinking Christian podcast, where he explores Christian formation, political theology, and technology. He holds a PhD in theological studies from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, serves as president of the D.L. Moody Center, and is an associate research fellow at the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology. His writing has appeared in lots of places, including the Wall Street Journal and Christianity.com. And his latest book, Discipleship and Discernment in the Digital Age, is due out from InterVarsity Press this fall. So with that, James, welcome to the FaithWorks Lancaster podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It's good to be here.
Happy to have you. I do have to admit, James, as we were doing intros before the episode, Eric's introduction for me felt like it was like 5 seconds, and the introduction for you was like a library of things that are being done. And you are easily the most ripped on this podcast, my friend. That is unacceptable. You're not allowed to be like that qualified. Yeah. I'm super excited to have you. Tell us, man, about your first job. What was the first job you ever had?
Yeah, so I'll tell you about my most official first job. My most official first job was cleaning buses for a high school. The district I was in, I'd clean buses over the summer, and there's not much to tell there. Then I worked on my girlfriend at the time, but became my wife. I worked on her dad's farm for a while. I think he wanted to keep an eye on me, and I was definitely unskilled labor. But I think the most relevant first job I probably had was as a personal trainer. My background is actually in kinesiology. And so I did my Bachelor of Science in kinesiology up in Chicago, and then worked at one of the boutique personal training studios that were kind of en vogue at the time. And so you can only come to the gym if you had a session with a client or with a trainer. And so I was one of those trainers. So I did that for the whole time I was finishing up my bachelor's degree, and then through my MDiv. I was a personal trainer, so about 5 years, and trained 40 hours a week with different clients for 5 years, and it was a lot of fun. So that was my first gig.
James, I got to say, because we've talked about this before too, and I've often thought, specifically when you were an MDiv student, the kinds of conversations you might have with the people you're training as they come in and they're new and they're like, hey, what do you do besides this? And you're like, well, actually, I'm an MDiv student, and that means XYZ. I imagine there's some fascinating interactions.
Well, hopefully this isn't too risque for your podcast, but I'll give you a funny story. So I was filling in. We had multiple trainers who would work in the studio, and sometimes we'd trade clients. We went out on vacation or something like that, and I was training another gentleman's client, and she came in. She got up on the treadmill, and we were just chatting. She was warming up. I was trying to get to know her a little bit, and I said, "Well, what do you do?" And she said, "Well, I'm a dancer." And I said, "Well, that's kind of fascinating. What sort of dancer?" And she comes back with, I work at the gentleman's club over at, wherever. And so I'm like, all I'm thinking in my head is I'm like, please don't ask me what I do. And so she does, of course. And I'm like, well, I'm a Master of Divinity student at Moody Bible Institute. And she's like, oh, and I mean, it was really quiet the rest of the session. So yes, you met all sorts. I had the distinct privilege of being able to train a lot of my clients over the 4 or 5 years I was there. I had tremendous client retention. They just kind of stuck with me. And so I got to develop really deep relationships with a lot of my clients. We do things on Easter together. I had Jewish clients that I would train. So we got to talk a lot about Christ and about Passover and about all these different kind of things. And it really was a lot of fun conversations. And even had a few clients go to church with me. So we had a really good, I had a really good rapport with my clients for the most part. But yeah, that one was a little awkward.
Yeah, all kinds. It's like, we will probably only ever see each other in this context.
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
Let's get to the real reason why James is with us today. So, James, you have created, among many things that you've done, I think a really helpful framework or architecture for, as you say, learning to think and live Christian. Right. And so we're gonna mention where people can find this later on, and you're free to mention that as well too. But I just want to let people know they're what the 4 elements are of this framework, this thinking Christian framework that you've put together. So here they are: 1, recognizing God's reality; 2, developing a theological disposition; 3, committing to theologic; and 4, engaging in disciplined inquiry. So before we jump into what this framework might mean for faith and work, I wonder if you could unpack for us a little bit of what this framework is and your thinking behind why you developed it and what you hope Christians get from it.
Yeah. So for a long time, I got my degree in theological studies. I worked at a Bible college, and for a long time, people would engage me as sort of the Bible answer man. And so they'd ask these different Bible questions about what does this passage mean, or what does this passage mean? Some of my favorites, I'm an Old Testament guy. So it's like, what's with those Nephilim? Right. And you're always dealing with Genesis 6:1-4, or, who did Cain marry? And you're like, this is really not what I want to do with my life. I don't really want to do Bible trivia. And so, but I think it pointed to a problem. It pointed this problem of people were really deeply interested in Scripture, but they're not necessarily asking the right questions. And what I mean by that, asking the right questions, I suppose there are no wrong questions, but really, how do you start thinking about your faith in a way that is going to hit the ground? And so what I wanted to do was to give people a framework as they're kind of coming to the Scriptures, as they're thinking about their lives, to help them integrate the two. So what does it look like for us to recognize God's reality? What does it look like for us to have this sort of theological disposition? These are not just things that we know about. They're not just facts that we have in our head. They're not different interpretations of Scripture that we can just turn to and say, this is the right interpretation. These are orientations. They're ways of being in the world that will help sort of situate us and reorient us to living life in God's presence. And so that's really what the framework was intended to do. I started presenting it at the beginning of my hermeneutics classes, or really any undergraduate or graduate class I would teach. I would start by helping students sort of frame this out and say, okay, this is where we're going. This is where I want you to be thinking through these things. And this is how we're going to orient ourselves to the material we're learning. And I just found that giving the students that framework actually helped them to develop better patterns as they were interacting with material throughout the course. They began to sort of think along that grain as opposed to against it.
I'm always a sucker for a good framework, so that's probably part of it. But I think it's often, right, it's this idea of creating spaces for people to kind of anchor parts of their lives onto and understand how they look at things. And like, this will often get like packaged in as like worldview language and things like that. And Eric and I have probably our own opinions and dispositions towards just calling things worldview and the classic lens analogy that's often used that I think has its own problems behind it. So, but I like in yours, this idea of it is around kind of, your disposition, the way you're thinking, the way you look at things, and then also kind of evolving into kind of discipline and how you live your life. I mean, that's very discipleship oriented. It's very Christ oriented. Christ was obviously very focused on how we live. Like, it should be changing not just how we see things, but what we actually do and focus on.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of it is rooted in a concept it's developed out of a philosopher named Philip Reef. But it's been more popularized at this point by a gentleman named Kevin Flatt, sacred social order. And so sacred social order is a little different than worldview. What sacred social order does is it says there is a sacred order. There's something cosmic. God is doing something in heaven. We often think about this. We might even think about this out of the book of Hebrews, let's say. What we see around us are the shadows and the copies, but there is some sort of substance, something that's being imitated up in heaven, right? And so the sacred order is what's happening up in heaven. It's what's happening. It is the truly sacred thing. It's what we're imitating here on earth. The social order is sort of the picture that we are to execute of that. It's the copy or the shadow. And so you have the social order is mediated through culture, which sort of transliterates the sacred to the social. And so that's the general idea between sacred and social order. But I think that what I've tried to do is say, okay, that's an interesting concept. It's fairly easy to explain, but then how does that hit the ground? What does that actually look like? And so how do you start to think of in terms of not rival worldviews where you need to combat them rationally, but in terms of rival sacred social orders, where you might be interacting in this context. Let's say you have a job. Well, that job is structuring in certain values. It's suggestive and pointing to and reflecting a certain sacredness of something, whatever that something actually is. And so Christians need to be savvy enough to recognize that, hey, there's a lot of good things, even in a rival sacred social order. It's not like it's all misses, right? There's something good and true and beautiful that these other sacred social orders are actually recognizing. And so Christians need to recognize the fullness of God's reality. And that's really the first pillar of the framework, is to say, what does it mean to recognize God's reality? Well, first, it means to recognize God's in it, and that we need to order our loyalties to God. But it also means that we can't ignore the goodness, truth, and beauty that's all around us in the world, as if it's not really good, true, or beautiful unless it's Christian. We see that in a different way, obviously, but it's not as if non-Christians don't see anything good, true, or beautiful in the world. And so that's what I'm trying to model it after, and give people a different sense of how to navigate the world as Christians, while they can still affirm these good things that other people, other non-Christians, other institutions are pointing to, while at the same time pointing beyond that goodness to the God who is their source. And I think that's really the heart of the true Christian activity we need to be involved with.
I'm curious from your perspective then, as we're looking at this, right? Like, how do so many sincere Christians, people who sincerely want to serve God, how do you think they end up with a faith that ends up fully engaged on that Sunday, but is effectively absent Monday through Friday? Where do you think the breakdown is that's causing this?
I think it comes in part at the dispositional stage. So It can come along any of these stages, right? But so let's just start with like recognizing God's reality. It can come by split allegiances. You see this a lot in the Old Testament, right? Yahweh was going to be good at war, but he was horrible at agriculture. And so we need another God. And so let's pull in a different person, let's pull in another God, and we'll just split our allegiances there. It was a lot of the reason that the kings were told not to have many wives, because these political alliances can become seductive, and they can begin to make the king think that he is deriving his authority and his ongoing kingdom through these political alliances, as opposed to serving the Lord. And so you can have those split allegiances. But my sense of it really is that many times when we're looking at that gap between Sunday and Monday, is it's a dispositional problem. So when I talk about disposition, what I really talk about is our underlying sense of how the world works. And it's habituated to us, right? We're not controlled by it, but we recognize it in a very deep, almost pre-reflective way. if I had to explain it, it'd be like, think about trying to teach somebody to ride a bike, and you could tell them how to turn the handlebars. You could tell them how to push the pedals. But if you just think about how are you going to explain someone that they need to engage all their different postural muscles in order to balance on a bike, you can't explain it because you just do it.
Yeah.
It's that sort of deep, pre-reflective, instinctual level, right? That you just have to get used to doing, and then you're used to doing it, and you do it. Yeah. And I think that when we shift from Sunday to Monday, this is sort of what happens with Christians. They get back into a field where the underlying sense of the way the world works has formed this disposition within them. And so how does the world operate? Well, it operates on, our institutional politics, and it requires a certain degree of, gross revenue and profits. And, that means we have to have our expenses at a certain level. So there are economic levers that make all of this work. Most of the institutions that we're involved with don't sit back and say, what we really need to make everything work? Obedience to God. We just need to be faithful, right? The Lord is our life and the length of our days, Deuteronomy 30:20. Like, we are not habituated to that way of thinking. And the institutions that we're in don't even attempt to habituate us to that way of thinking. And so when a Christian leaves the church on Sunday and they re-enter life on Monday, they're working in a very different realm. And I think that many times we just don't recognize it.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I will say this, I want to connect this back. This is where I interjected on you, Josh, before, so apologies for that. But James, a lot of what you're saying, I want to connect it to some other conversations we've had on this podcast, which is really trying to dispel the myth of this dichotomy between the sacred and the secular, right? If we could just set that aside, recognize that as you've been saying earlier here, that we all occupy these a sacred order, right? It's just it can be competing sacred orders, but nonetheless, this is all wrapped up. There's not this kind of compartmentalization or separation, which I think is really, as you're saying here too, at the heart of a lot of this disconnect that we have between our Sunday faith and our Monday life. Is we need to dispel the myth of that of them, and somehow they are distinct entities where, like, for instance, obedience to God works on Sunday, but somehow isn't as relevant on Monday in a work context. That is not the case, right? So that's really helpful. Right. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we look at the New Testament, we see this all over the place. It's easy to see the sacred order in the Old Testament, right? The cultic apparatus is very present. We have the tabernacle, we have the temple. But in the New Testament, we have these things too. They're just a little bit more veiled. And so you have something like the sacrifice of praise in Hebrews, or you have Paul suggesting that, holy living is the way that we give out ourselves as a sacrifice to the Lord. It's our sacrificial service. He even talks about himself as being poured out as a drink offering in the letter to the Philippians. And later, the gift that the Philippians send to help him in his need. This is an offering, a sacrifice to the Lord. We do all of these things. We still occupy that sacred order. We just don't bring bulls and goats to a temple and sacrifice them. We do other things along the way. And so we are still living in that sacred social order. We don't live in a secular space. We live in a sacred social space. And we have to learn then, what does it mean for us to always be Christian and also operate within the world?
Yeah, well said. I enjoy that. So the first move in your framework, as we've been saying, is reordering our loves away from competing loyalties. But to get down to practicalities here, at work, those loyalties can often feel completely legitimate, again, because of maybe it's the environment, it's the perspective, the worldview, the orientation of the individuals that somebody's working with. So whether it's career, rationale, or financial security, or the approval of a boss or a team that one's working with. So how does a Christian, in your view, James, actually practice that reordering, right? When the competing loves aren't obviously wrong, right? When it's not like, when somebody's doing good good labor on Monday, right? Yeah, they're not like in some industry that is obviously overtly sinful and disobedient to God and His law. How does a Christian actually reorder their thinking and their living when those different loyalties seem fair?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. Number one, I always like to help people understand what I mean when I say reordering loves. I think it's good to have a picture. And so the picture I usually give people is scuba diving, right? If we think about the way that we love God in terms of scuba diving, when you scuba dive, you're completely immersed in the water. And your interactions with the environment change completely. You don't breathe the same. You don't communicate the same. You can't move the same. Right? If you're trying to convey something to people who are under the water with you, you're using hand motions, you're not trying to scream at them. It changes everything about the way that you interact. That's what I mean when I say this is the immersive love of God, right? And we're all trying to get to that point where we are so immersed within the love of God that it's kind of like scuba diving. We don't communicate the same. We don't move the same. We don't interact the same. And so there's this immersive aspect that I think people sometimes don't often get. We've gotten a little caught up in like the prioritization, like first I love God. And then once I'm done loving God, then I can love family. And then after I'm done loving family, I can love work. That isn't really how the Bible presents it. It's more like scuba diving, being completely immersed. And then that immersion, as you're interacting with these other loves, you're doing that in a cruciform manner, we might say, in a way that would be commensurate with Christ. So that picture, I think, is really helpful for people. The second thing I would say is we need to recognize the good, right? There are many areas where we should be able to recognize the good. When I was personal training, yes, you could get caught up in the vanity of it all, right? People wanted to look better, and there is something vain about that. But the reality is that we live in a fairly sedentary world, and getting out and doing some exercise, getting stronger, making your body healthier, there's good in that. We need to be able to recognize that good and resituate it into our own sacred social order. Why is it good? How is the good that our job is placing on one activity or another? Economic productivity. That's a good thing, right? But what's it missing? What's our job missing, right? There's always more there. And so what I would recommend people think about is your jobs, any job, and I would say I'd throw Christian jobs in here too most of the time, right? They're offering you something as a complete story that's actually pretty incomplete. And so when we're seeing something that is good in our job, we need to be asking ourselves, but what else is there? What's missing in this goodness, right? How does this goodness point us to the triune God who is its source? And if it's not, what else might we think about in order to get to that point? So I think we're always seeing sort of partial pictures. And if we can get a grasp on the idea that we're always seeing partial pictures, we don't get so committed to those partial pictures. We're always looking sort of beyond them to the next step, to seeing how they might grow, like what we're missing. And I think that's a really important aspect of learning to do this in the workplace. It can be good, it can seem good, but it's never going to be complete. A lot of times I'll phrase it as Christians shouldn't settle for wholesomeness because only holiness will do. There are a lot of things that we can see in the world that are wholesome, right? And that are good. And we shouldn't just dismiss those things, but we shouldn't settle for them either. We should recognize them for what they are. They're God's gifts sort of shining through to us. And it's our job as Christians to resituate those into our understanding of who God is.
I love that. I think the idea of this incomplete picture thing is really helpful, right? That you're always seeing kind of a story or a picture of something, but it's never quite complete, right? It really, I think that applies to a lot of our day-to-day lives, right? Where we're going through life with a story and narrative that we see happening around us, and it's never quite complete, right? And like, and not settling for the wholesome, I think is a great point. Now, I will admit, James, as you're talking, not settling for the wholesome, my annoying brain went immediately to like, okay, so don't settle for really nice cat pictures online.
That's right.
There's a deeper meaning. Like, but I think this gets to kind of your theologic concept too, right? Because I've talked with a lot of people about this type of idea too, and as I've wrestled with it myself, being somebody who went from being in pastoral ministry to just a Christian job work, but my day-to-day was not preaching. My day-to-day was mainly having Eric tell me I had to do something in Excel or a file that I didn't love, and like trying to see how I looked at that differently, right? You talk about this idea in Theologic is learning to reason differently, reasoning with the grain of kind of God's reality, right? Again, this like more complete picture as I see it of what you're talking about. But I think a lot of times what people come back with is, okay, this is good, but what does that look different for me as a machinist, as somebody just working on a car, as an accountant who everybody thinks I'm not that exciting and I only work in Excel? Like, what does that look different for them? Like, how do their decisions look different in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, making decisions is a difficult one because I don't actually think the Bible gives us a recipe for making decisions, right? Mm-hmm. So it's hard to know exactly what those decisions are going to look like. In part, we could default to something and just say, well, it's about personal character. And so you should respect your boss and you should be kind to others and, very sort of Mr. Rogers-y Christian advice. And I don't mean to trivialize that. I think it's important, but we hear it so often that I don't think it's really the meat of the question people are asking. So yes, do your work with integrity. Yes, of course, be kind to the people in your who you're working with, right? Try not to curse them out or, shove them in front of large objects so that they get hurt or whatever, right? Like those things are just sort of baseline. Yep. Every Christian should be doing that.
Don't do that. I agree with James.
Don't do that. Don't do that. But I would say, like, when we get down to brass tacks, what does it look like? I've thought through it in various ways about what I've done, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would say, something like, did I was a dean over an online school, and then I was a dean over the residential college. I taught online and I taught residentially. I always enjoyed the residential teaching more. I'll just be real honest. I like the interaction with the students. I could get to know them. I would say it's even better when I got to spend, 3 weeks overseas in a hostel with the students where we really got to know each other and we could, have fellowship and play games and then also do the education alongside. Like that was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I was able to do more with the students formatively than I ever could online. Right. And so then you come back and you're teaching an online course and you're like, well, what does this do really? I'm just sort of interacting on a discussion board and I'm like, it feels so much less than what you could be doing. And I think part of the way I've tried to reframe that in my own mind is remembering that my wife went through an online program and she went through that online program because that's what she had time for. Mm-hmm. Like that's what could fit into our life. She had 3 kids at home with a husband who wasn't overly helpful. She had, she had a really busy job. And so she needed that and someone was willing to provide it. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can get out of our own heads, like as I'm building this widget, as I'm typing in this discussion board, as I'm grading this paper or whatever, I may not be having the most fulfilling experience ever. Luckily, it's not really about us having the most fulfilling experience ever. Sometimes we are trying to build up others and giving up something that we might want, our time, our effort, or whatever. We're trying to serve other people. And so I think one of the answers to this question needs to be, how is what I'm doing right now going to be of service to others? How is it that what I'm doing, even though it may not be particularly fulfilling to me, how might it contribute to the health, wealth, prosperity, flourishing, however we want to say that, of whomever this is being done for. And so I like to go back to the illustration of Goodwill Hunting, right? He's cleaning up the Harvard, he's working as a janitor. And there's this one scene where Robin Williams talks about it, and he's defending his work as a janitor, saying it's honorable work, right? And he's doing it sort of in a defensive mode, but it's really true, right? If we think about the people who care for the things around us, sort of the people who don't get a lot of accolades in life, but whenever you walk into a restroom, it's clean and nice to use and comfortable, as comfortable as it's going to be in a restroom, to be in there, right? Like, I mean, I think those are intangibles that we don't often consider when we're thinking about faith and work, that these things actually are service to others. They're not just jobs. They're actually contributing to the experience of someone else, the well-being of other people. And that transcends things like, healthcare is an easy one, kind of, because you're taking care of people or what have you. But, what are you really doing when you do a spreadsheet all day? Well, you're still contributing to the overarching system that is training these students, in your case, right? And so there are these pieces that just need to be there for us to care for one another. And I think that's part of what Theologic points us to. Romans 14 and 15 does this beautifully. It doesn't do it in the context of work. But if you think about that contrast between the strong and the weak, what Paul's encouraging the strong to do is not to lord over something that's actually true. They could eat whatever they wanted. They could, there's nothing special about these other days, right? Like, he largely agrees with the people that he would consider strong in those passages. But what does he tell them to do? He tells them to think about what they're doing to their brothers. Are you causing them to stumble, or are you helping them to flourish? You shouldn't be doing the former. You should be doing the latter.
I love this, because as you're talking, right, I think it's, for those listening, I want to highlight something. I think really what it comes down to is, as I've talked to people about this, it is less about the decisions you make at work, and it's more about how you see your work in the bigger reality of what's actually going on, right? Like, the perfect example, right, back to the space I gave, which is like, what really changed things for me is when I started to see, like, okay, yeah, that Excel or that thing I was working on, right, it's, what am I doing in that moment? I could view this as just, I'm creating some little thing that somebody's eventually going to use, or it's going to do something somewhere, right, while this other person's off there teaching salvation to some student in a room across the hall, right? Or I could see it as, I'm building something into a system that's going to end up supporting all of that work. Just like in seeing things differently, not only in how it serves others, but how it, I think, reflects the nature of God, I think, is the other thing that really changed it for me, of seeing, like, okay, that system I'm building, yes, that's going to help somebody somewhere, but also it's reflecting a God of the universe who, quite frankly, cared about making systems, because he made the entire universe that we see and the fabric that it's built. And just seeing that differently. So as I'm hearing you talk, it's just kind of clicking for me. It is less about the decisions. Yes, we want to be good. We want to care for people. We don't want to push them out in front of whatever you joked about pushing them in front of. But it's a reframing of how we see the world and our actions.
Yeah, and I'll say Genesis 14 is one of my favorite illustrations of this. It's after Abram beats all the different kings, and he's rescuing Lot, and he's coming back, and he's got all the spoils. He gives 1/10 of the spoils to Melchizedek, who blesses him and gives glory to the God Most High. And then when the king of Sodom comes and says, hey, Abram, keep all the stuff, just give me the people back, what does Abram do? He says, no, I'm not going to do that, because I made a vow to the Lord that I would never do anything that would allow you to come back and say, I made Abram rich. And so he's making this decision in the moment to make sure he doesn't make a decision that would allow someone else to take glory from God. I think it's a wonderful way for us to think through some of this stuff too. So in addition to the positive aspects that we can think through, we can also be thinking through how would doing this right now suggest that someone else could take the glory as opposed to God. I think it's just a great question to kind of keep in the Rolodex of questions you can ask as you're trying to make a decision on a daily basis, to just sit back and go, is this going to allow X, Y, or Z, what my boss, my business, my institution, whatever it is, to take glory away from God? And then what should I do in this moment? Because I don't really want that to happen.
Yeah.
So it's just another interesting sort of paradigm shift. And again, it relates to that theologic kind of aspect. And I don't think theologic has to remain flexible because it needs to be sort of patterned after the whole thought that we get through the scriptures, which isn't, just a single point of view or logic that runs through it. It's multifaceted.
That's really good.
That's great. Appreciate that, James. We've just been talking about reframing, looking at our work differently, recognizing we didn't put it in quite these words, but recognizing that how we feel about the work we're doing at any given time, whether cleaning restrooms, driving a forklift, farming, however we feel about it in a moment is not an appropriate gauge to measure its impact or importance, right? And as evangelicals, I think particularly we can struggle with that, right? We can be inclined toward, the emotional highs seem to have some kind of significance that maybe they have at a time, but it's not a good measure, right? And so similarly with work, how we're feeling about it at any given moment should not be the metric that we're using to judge whether or not it's actually good work. We are participating in God's providential care for his creation and his world when we do our work, when we're cleaning the restroom, when we're driving the forklift, whatever it might be. So it seems that, James, a lot of your work seems to address the gap broadly, again, not just with faith and work, but a gap between what the church produces and what faithful discipleship actually requires, right? And so kind of making a bit of a turn here, not to beat up on the church, so to speak, but there's kind of a gap or a lack in Christian education that I think contributes to this this division between how we think about Sunday and how we think about Monday, right? As we've been talking through this conversation. So, James, from your perspective, what do you think churches are missing when it comes to equipping people for their vocations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously a theological depth that we need to develop as we do this. I don't think it should be up to folks who can just sit around and think about this all day to try to convey this to people who are out doing the work. So I do think churches could do a much better job of, doing some good, strong theological, biblical education on a regular basis. I think that the movement toward away from Sunday school towards small groups has probably contributed to some of that. But ultimately, I think that we've just gotten to a point where everything around us, whether it's the technology or the ability to travel or the endless stream of videos that we can watch in short form on YouTube, have conditioned us not to really look a lot for depth and nuance. And I think that's probably, my sense is that that's probably getting worse, not better. And so I think that the church at this point needs to become the community that sort of helps its people reclaim that nuance, reclaim that depth. I would say, though, that, to your point, Eric, we're not trying to beat up on the church because we're all part of it. And so part of what we're all sort of lacking here is, I think, a recognition that we need to adopt a different cadence. I know that when I go to church on Sunday mornings, I am not always thinking about, oh, good, it's a break from my weekly grind. A lot of times I'm thinking, geez, I wish I could just sleep in. And that is not the best way to approach church on Sundays. We've got to start thinking about this in terms of that sort of, and maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. I'm not advocating Sabbath here when I say this, but that Sabbath cycle in the Old Testament, 6 days of work, seventh day rest, was actually intended to sort of punctuate the dependence of the Israelites on God for everything that they were getting. That your work is not trivial, not unimportant, but it is ultimately done in dependence on the God of the universe. And so this last day of Sabbath is marked off for him. And it signals the fact that God is the one who is providing for his people. And I think we haven't quite grasped that just yet, that as we re-enter the workforce on Monday, we're trying to sort of go back out and be like, well, church was a nice break, I guess. And now I got to go earn a living, right? We're not seeing this as the moment where we get to stand in the presence of a holy God, worshiping him and sort of resetting ourselves for the rest of the week.
It's fitting us and
so
orienting us for that.
That's right. And I think that that's sort of something that each one of us has to recapture, that this time on Sunday is our moment to be in the presence, in a sacred moment with God that has been set apart for him. And that this is really crucial to our own personal formation and will help carry us through what can be a very arduous and long week. I mean, I work for a Christian institution and I have arduous and long weeks. Right. It's not like everything is always easy. And so
I know what you're talking about. It's like, it's just sunflowers and rainbows over here.
I wish mine were all, puppies and rainbows, but it really is just that. I mean, I think that we've got to recapture this notion that what we're doing during our weeks, whether it's our work week or whether it's our worship, we are copying the sacred. And so the cadence of our lives need to copy that sacred. The spaces that we occupy need to copy that sacred. We need to be reflecting that understanding of who God is and what God is doing so that, we're essentially embodying that part of the Lord's Prayer that says, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We have something to say about that. We can do his will on earth as it's done in heaven, but we've got to orient ourselves rightly within the world to do so.
I love the orientation piece of this, the cadence, how we have to change things in that dynamic and that emphasis, right? Because we Eric and I keep saying this as we ask some of these questions about what do we feel like as the church we're missing, and emphasizing the we're missing. It's not that there's churches out there, they're just missing things. It's a us thing. And I think a huge part of it is all of us need to look at the cadence in which we live our lives and how we look at our work and how we engage with that. Because a lot of us can very easily look at the church and go, we should be doing this. We should be doing this. It's like, well, like to your point, James, well, yeah, but like when everybody is just showing up on Sunday and then disappearing for the entire week and living their life like nothing is different, it's difficult at that area. Like we as the church own that collectively as a group and how our cadence and our lives, how we live those lives. And it's hard. Anybody listening, I get it. It's hard, right? Like you have kids, you have family, you have work, you have all these things. You're trying to figure out how you juggle all of them. But it's important for us to think about when we're talking faith and work, it's not just about how we view our work differently within our faith and as believers. It's also how we view and live our lives differently from the moment we get up to the moment we go to sleep. And maybe even as we are asleep, depending on the time that we do that. All needs to transform and change the way we look at how we live our life day to day.
Can I throw out just a couple more things? I know we're getting close to time. So
go for it.
One of the things I like to emphasize with people is we never mistake a bath for a baptism. Right. So when a baptism happens, we know it's a baptism happening. We know someone's not just jumping in the tub. Right. And we know that because
I hope so. I'd just like to clarify.
Yeah,
we don't
I'm really betting that people don't confuse bath and a baptism. But at a baptism, there are words that are spoken. There are people who are involved. There's a whole congregation there. There's a ritual that happens. We've turned that into a sacred experience. But when we take a bath at home, there's different elements, right? There's some, maybe a bubble bath, definitely some shampoo. There's a loofah or whatever we use, right? Like you've got different elements involved, and so in part, you don't mistake a bath for a baptism. And I think that's something that we need to be carrying through in every aspect of our lives, right? That there's this difference. So don't mistake your theological work, right? The work that you're doing for the kingdom, like do that work all the time. don't just default to saying, well, a baptism is a bath, so it doesn't really make any difference. Don't collapse the two categories. Let those two categories be separate. And so as you re-enter work on Monday, this is not my work, and that was my theology. No, this is my theological work. I'm now doing something for Christ, and struggle through to figure out, how is it that I recognize this as a baptism and not a bath? How is it that I understand this from a ritual element, participatory perspective, that what I'm doing right now is actually for Christ? It's for the building up of the kingdom. And I think that takes hard work. There's no easy answer for that one, right? It's just not simple. And the other thing I would say is, it's sort of fun and pithy to say, okay, you wouldn't mistake a bath for a baptism. But when we look at it from a work perspective, it is much more difficult to sort of filter through those things. And this is why I'm really happy that we're able to confess, right? We're going to get this wrong. We're never going to get it perfectly right. And I think that that's okay. There's a reason that we continually have to go back and re-agree with God, right? That we've done something wrong, that we've done something off. And so this isn't about perfection out of the gate. It's about a process of committing to and deepening our understanding of what God is putting in our path and how we understand it in relation to him.
That's really good. I think that's a great point to end on, this idea that you're probably listening to this podcast hoping we'll give you all the answers so that you can leave and do this right. Well, here's the final point from James's episode. We're all gonna do this wrong. Yep, we're all gonna screw this up. But I do think that's an important reminder, because I think we a lot of times come to these conversations, whether it's faith and work or it's other different types of dynamics of how we live out our lives, and they quickly become conversations of like, okay, how can I do this so I'm like that great, perfect Christian who's nailed this? And the reality is none of us are going to nail this. And the beauty of being a believer is that we have Christ, and we want to seek to do it the best we can, to follow him, to live as disciples. But when we get it wrong, that's why confession is a beautiful thing. It's also why Christ as Savior, who did do this perfectly, is a beautiful thing, because we can lean on his perfection in it and not our own. And I think that's a great place to end on. And it takes not the pressure off, like we shouldn't be caring about this or doing things, but it takes some of the pressure off to be like, listen, you're not going to be perfect, and that's okay. And that's the reality of who Christ is. He was so because we aren't able to be. And I think that's a perfect reminder as we think even about how we look at our work and what we're doing. So James, seriously, man, thank you for jumping into this conversation with us, from everything from working out to not pushing people in front of things, and some actual serious conversation between there. I think it's been really helpful just to be talking through this. I mean, that's what this podcast is all about for us. It's just a conversation to try to work this out together as everybody who's working in different environments, whether it's theological education, whether it's other places and these types of things. We're all just trying to figure this out together. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want to hear more from James, because you're like, man, he is much better at being a host than Eric and Josh are, you're right. You should go check him out. So go to James Spencer, jamesgspencer.com. I will make sure to put this in our episode notes on our website as well. And then thinkingchristian.org. And then also make sure to check out his book when it comes, I think in the fall, right, James? As long as everything goes according to plan.
Yep. Fingers crossed.
Yep. Discipleship and Discernment in the Digital Age. Make sure to check that out as well. Seriously, James, thank you for your time. This has been fantastic.
It's great to be here, guys. Anytime.
Well, there's no way to feel less good at what I do than interviewing James, and I love it. That was amazing. Thank you, James. You were awesome, my friend. Those listening, just remember, you can find us. You've already listened to us, so you found us in some way. But if you'd like to continue finding us, make sure you subscribe, hit the bell, all those fun things. You can find us on YouTube and LinkedIn at FaithWorks Lanc. We greatly appreciate it. It helps out the podcast if you do. And then you can always be notified when more cool people like James come on the podcast and you want to listen to them. You can check that out on any of those spaces. Reminder as well, Apple and Spotify, you can find us there as well at FaithWorks Lanc as well. Yeah, I think there's a website
Yeah.
too, right, Eric?
Yeah, there is a website, right? Yeah, it's been some time in the making, but now that we're now by the time you're hearing this, we're up and running now. So if you're old school, you want to check us out on the website. We are at faithworkslanc.org.
Go find us there if you're old school. That hurt a little bit. Old school is a website. It's fine. Go check us out there.
It's true.
Yeah. Thank you for listening, everybody. I hope this episode, like many of the others, helps you kind of see how that ordinary labor that you have is a part of God's redemptive work and what he is doing in this world. And we hope to uncover that even more in upcoming episodes of FaithWorks Lancaster Conversations on Calling. Thanks, everybody.
Until next time.